Good afternoon. I hope that everybody has had a productive and exciting morning. There's been a tremendous amount of energy at the hotel and the various sessions we've had. You had a nice lighter panel today at lunch that I thought was fascinating myself. But now let's move on to the second part of our program. We're really honored to have as our very special guest this afternoon, Paul Ryan. He was the 54th Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives from 2015 to 19, the youngest Speaker of the House in nearly 150 years. He spearheaded efforts to reform the United States tax code, rebuild national defense, expand domestic energy production, combat the opioid epidemic, reform criminal justice, and promote economic opportunity. He was first elected to Congress at the age of 28, and he spent 2 decades representing the state of Wisconsin. Before he became Speaker of the House, he was Chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Chairman of the House Budget Committee. In 2012, he was selected to serve as Governor Mitt Romney's vice presidential nominee. And he's widely recognized as one of the intellectual leaders of the modern conservative movement, including former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Paul Ryan, moderated by the co-CEO of Bridgewater Associates, David McCormick.
Thank you. Afternoon.
Thank you. Well, Speaker Ryan, we're so glad to have you here.
Afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Thankful that you could take time out of your busy hunting schedule to be with us today. I know there's been quail and ducks and elk and deer.
And goose.
And goose.
And goose, that's right.
Since you've stepped down as Speaker. I thought I might start with just a personal question. There's so much to talk about, and I'll try to keep the conversation moving. But when we sort of all know about your meteoric rise and really started with flipping burgers at McDonald's in Janesville, Wisconsin, to being the young career. But there's so many things as you look back on that career, which is still very much in the making. What would be the thing you'd point to as contributing most to your success?
Well, interestingly, when I got that job at McDonald's when I was 16 in Janesville, Wisconsin, the manager asked me, okay, you're hired, what would you like to do? I said, well, I'd like to be in the front at the cash register interacting with, with the customers. He said, I don't think you have the interpersonal skills for that, so I'm going to put you on the quarter grill. So I ended up, grilling for a summer. What would be the most monumental thing? To Congress for what I thought was going to be just an interim. My ultimate goal in my life at the time was I wanted to go back to the University of Chicago, get my doctorate in economics, and practice economics. I ended up working for a guy named Jack Kemp as his staff economic policy person. And that meeting, that mentorship that Jack Kemp provided me is what changed the direction of my life. So I lost my dad when I was a young person, and always had mentors. And so I'd say the one thing that really changed my trajectory of my life was the mentorship that Jack Kemp provided me and the inspiration he gave me. And he basically steered me into public life as a vocation. And I never thought I would ever run for office, let alone Congress. And really, it was
That's great. He'd be proud, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, just taking that career just to this most recent chapter as Speaker, and really the last 2 years of your speakership when President Trump came into office, as you and I spoke about, that was a very productive Congress.
Yeah.
And we're seeing some of the implications of that in the economy today. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your outlook for the economy, the U.S. economy, and a little bit on how the policy choices may have contributed to that.
Well, I think it's really a result of the policy choices that were made. Let's back up. We had a very deep recession in 2000. Was not a very good economic response, in my opinion. We had overregulation, poor tax policy. We had the worst tax code in the industrialized world, and a lot of other decisions that were made that I think kept the economy from reaching its potential. We then in 2016 ran in an election on an agenda we called the Better Way at the time. And it was a long program of regulatory relief, tax reform, things. We ran on this after Donald Trump got the nomination. We walked him through, kind of just what we had been doing. We ended up winning. And after that election, I told the president-elect, I'm going to come to you with a plan. So I got together with Mitch McConnell, my counterpart, put together a plan for 2 years. Donald Trump is a builder. The guy's been building real estate and skyscrapers for his entire career. So I put together a 4-foot by 4-foot Gantt chart on what we would do for the next 2 years in Congress in 2017 and 2018 to execute this agenda, who did what, where, when. It was right after the inauguration. We walked him through the Gantt chart for a number of hours, actually. And at the end of it, which frankly was the longest undivided attention I ever really saw him apply to something, he likes to go off on tangents sometimes. He said, I love this. I just want more infrastructure, kind of like more cowbell, And then we basically ran Congress for that 2-year period on that plan. We passed 1,178 bills out of the House. About 600 of those made it through the Senate into law. To give you a sense of that, the average production of a 2-year session of Congress is about 400 or 500 bills. So we more than doubled the production of Congress. It was the most productive session of Congress since Reagan's first term. Anywhere from the 17 different regulatory relief bills, which opened up oil and gas and fracking and exporting crude, to repealing Dodd-Frank for community banks, to opioids, to rewriting the tax code for the first time in a generation, and a whole host of other things like the military. It was such a productive time. Over 80% of those things were bipartisan. And so the point I keep trying to make to people is so much got done in the first half of Donald Trump's term that it really gave us a strong foundation under the economy. And so because the animal spirits of our U.S. economy had been released after being held back, we saw very, very good growth. I think we're going to see another good growth this year. The trade uncertainty is the one amount of uncertainty that came back into the economy. Our whole mantra was get uncertainty out of the economy, get uncertainty out of the economy. The president had a specific trade philosophy that he applied. I think he reached many of his goals. So I think we're going to have sort of a hiatus on trade fights this year so that uncertainty premium or discount, which arguably took about a quarter point away from our economy, is no longer there. So I think we're going to have a very good year because we have a very strong foundation. Our economy is hitting all these metrics and benchmarks. I won't rattle all the statistics other than to say it's one of the best economies we've had in a long time. And most importantly, lower and middle income workers are arguably benefiting the most, proportionally speaking. Yes.
Is part of the trade agenda. Now reflecting back on the last several years, what are your thoughts on how that agenda was prosecuted and what the outcomes have been?
Yeah, it's the one thing the president and I didn't really see eye to eye. I always thought the China fight was important and that needed to take place. But my thinking at the time, and I still think this way, was we should really work with our allies, not have a five-front fight on trade, just focus on China and work with our allies. The president saw it a little differently, and I guess to his point and his benefit, he built a lot of credibility up because he really showed that he doesn't mind. So you don't have to go through Congress to raise tariffs. There are a few different laws that you can use as a tool through the executive branch. He did that. But I think he's brought this full circle. USMCA, which is the new NAFTA, is effectively TPP for Mexico and Canada. We also have a new Korea deal. We have a bilateral agreement with Japan. So as a person who actually I was one of 3 people in Washington left who wanted to do TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. When I was Ways and Means Chair, I wrote the law called Trade Promotion Authority so we could go get these agreements. We're basically moving through and getting that agreement, incrementally, one country bilateral agreement at a time. So I think the president is taking his own path of getting China. We have a phase 1 deal in place, USMCA's in place, and now we have Korea and Japan. So I think we're in a much better place than where we were on trade. And I think he probably buttressed his credibility to get the kinds of agreements he got. We still have to work with Europe, and as soon as England is able to, as soon as the UK can, we'll do an agreement with the UK. And I think that's all to the good.
Well, we'll come back to China in a minute, but a final point on the domestic economy. What would, if there was a second Trump term, what do you think the legislative agenda would likely look like based on your experience?
As chair of the Ways and Means Committee, I spent pretty much my career working on tax reform. We brought our tax code from what we believed then was the worst in the industrialized world to one of the top 3 in the industrialized world. It was very much wired for growth. It's probably the key reason why we had but their CapEx has been a little low lately. And I think there are a couple reasons for that, but one of which is there's some expiring provisions in the tax code, like expensing, full expensing, individual rates, the lower tax rate for pass-through, which are small businesses. Those have got to get extended and renewed, and we think those will. We made permanent what we knew we couldn't keep permanent, and we made temporary what we knew could be made. So you'll see an extension of the current tax code, and then I think the president will probably put an effort in healthcare reform again, which is absolutely necessary if you want to get the debt under control. The only bill that we didn't pass of our list of things that we said we would do was our healthcare legislation. It passed the House, but it failed by 1 vote in the Senate. That would have done a lot to unlock choice and competition in healthcare, lower prices, lower premiums, and reduce the national debt. I think in a second Trump term, you'll go after that. You'll see more trade agreements in a second Trump term. You'll see an extension of the current tax code. And those are things.
Infrastructure?
In infrastructure. So that's the last point I was going to make, which is the Democrats would not give Donald Trump a big infrastructure deal because they wanted to, frankly, deny him a signature achievement. What we found was successful during my speakership was aviation infrastructure bill. We're redoing our entire aviation system now, and we're going from radar to GPS base, which will add a lot of efficiency. But what I think the president would really like to do is a big infrastructure bill, asset recycling, roads, bridges. That I think is something that will have to happen. And you'll have to figure out a way to replace the gas tax. The gas tax is a losing revenue proposition. It doesn't work much as it was originally designed. We have electric cars. We have more efficient vehicles. So some replacement revenue system will be required for that, and I think that's going to be in the next big infrastructure bill.
Mm-hmm. Let me turn to looking external for a minute. And we've 40 years since the end of the Cold War, almost 20 years now since 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan. The continued rise of China in conversation and a reflection on America's role in the world. What are your thoughts on America's role?
Where you have consensus among policymakers in Washington, left and right, and everywhere in between, is the need to deal with China. That is, of all things where there's a consensus. And so I don't think, no matter what happens in this next election, you're going to see a huge change in our China policy. Now, total decoupling is sort of implausible and inadvisable, in my opinion. But there's going to be a level of decoupling from China, particularly in tech. And I think that's something that people are just going to have to adjust. That's something that's here to stay. And hopefully we can have a productive China policy that's good for China, good for America, good for the world, and avoids big conflict. But there's going to be some level of economic conflict, I think. Here in the region, I think it's extremely important. I was one of the people who back in the early 2000s pushed for the Middle East Free Trade Area Initiative with Condi Rice and Steve Hadley and others. I still believe in this. I think the president does as well, which is the MISA, we call it, the Middle East Strategic Alliance. That started out with a lot of fanfare. It hasn't been attended to nearly as much as it should have, but I think there's going to be a redoubling, particularly in a second Trump term, which I assume you want to get into politics. There will be a redoubling of effort to build out our Middle East operation. That's civilian, that's economics. I think that also means we need to have more trade agreements. I worked on the trade agreement with Bahrain, Oman, Jordan, Morocco, but we have UAE, Kuwait, we have others, Saudi Arabia. I ultimately would love to see a GCC-wide trade agreement with America in addition to our military and civilian cooperation. And institutionalizing that is the key. So the concern in the region, I think the region has with us, is the reliability and stability of our partnership with America. What if we go from a Donald Trump administration to, God forbid, in my opinion, like a Bernie Sanders administration? How do you institutionalize a strong alliance and relationship with America in this region? That, to me, is what we should focus on. And that is why things like the MISA are very, very important. And long-term relationships, we can make sure that, like before, when we went from one administration to the next, you still had a continuity of policy between America and the Gulf. And I think that that is something that can be established. We have more work to do on that front so that America is seen as a reliable partner going forward. I think the president understands the power of this region, the power of our relationship, and the need to make sure, for lots of reasons, for whether it's radical Islam to just trade and peace and prosperity. We're the country, I would argue, with the best motives on these fronts, and we have very important partnerships, and we've got to maximize those, and we need to institutionalize that relationship.
Well, part of that ability to project American influence has always been grounded in this notion of the American dream.
Right.
And you from rural Wisconsin, me from rural Pennsylvania, I think we both way in the minds of many, and maybe leading to some of the dynamics we see in the United States today. What are your thoughts on that? I know you have got a foundation that's focused in part on this. What are your thoughts on the American dream? What are your thoughts on the state of polarization in American politics today?
I mean, so I created a foundation. I left Congress a year ago. I created a foundation called the American Idea Foundation to promote the American idea, which, as I describe it, is the condition of your birth does not determine the outcome of your life. No matter who you are and where you come from, if you apply yourself, you can make it. And we want to build a society where that is possible. That is the tradition of the American idea. And the polling is really clear. More and more people don't think it's there for them. More and more people, for the first time in ever, we have a generation who are believing that their children will not be as well off as they are. We've never had that thinking in our country before. Kids would be better off than the parents. And so this is a challenge we have to confront. I think it also has given rise to the kind of populism and the anxiety and the polarization that we are experiencing. Democracy itself is under a great stress test. It's being stress tested in Europe, it's being stress tested in America, and that's not just polarization. And I think the feedstock of this polarization, of this anxiety, is economic anxiety. So to the extent that we can deny oxygen to hyperpolarization will be measured by how well we can reintegrate people back into the economy. I think the last couple of years have been pretty good on that front, but it's got to be sustained. We see wage growth. We see the lowest unemployment rate among African Americans, Latinos, Asians. We see more women in the workforce than ever before. Our labor force participation rates are all-time, 20-year highs. Our unemployment rate in America is the lowest. News on that front, but we're going to have to sustain that for a long time to address the kind of anxiety that is easily preyed upon by the forces of polarization. And we have a virtual cottage industry of polarization in both parties. In the old days, like 10 years ago, if you wanted to succeed in politics, you scaled a meritocracy. And we measured success based on legislation, policy. Could you be an innovative policy leader, and could you persuade people that this was the best policy to embrace? Your colleagues, your country, your constituents. Now we have entertainment wings of our party. You can leapfrog the entire meritocracy, and if you can just be a very good performer on television, you can have a lot of Twitter followers and good Facebook followers, and you can out-entertain people. Success is measured, risen on both sides. There's an entertainment wing of the Republican Party as there is one on the Democratic Party. And that leads to more fragmentation, that leads to more polarization, and that in and of itself is a stress test of democracy. I think you overcome this by trying to make aspirational, inclusive politics, hopeful politics, politics that appeal to the best of people, not the worst of people. We have to find ways of making those successful politics. We have to find ways of making that the kind of politics that people who want to succeed in politics choose to embrace because it's the best form of politics. We have a long ways to go to get there. But I think that's really, that's something that we're going to have to overcome if we want to pass this stress test of democracy that's occurring right now.
And there appear to be fundamental debates and changes going on in both parties. if you had to sort of look forward, what's happening on both sides of the aisle in terms of what appears now?
Well, it's populism, and what worries me about the populism, there's upside and downside to populism, but the downside of populism is both the right and the left, or the left and the right, have decided that identity politics is successful politics. And identity politics is politics that seeks to divide people into certain groups and categories so that you can divide an electorate so that you can get 50 plus 1% and win an election. That is now practiced on both sides of the aisle, and that's disruptive to the cohesion of a society. To the good side, I think we have reproven our principles and policies as a center-right party that they work again. So President Trump, just like Ronald Reagan, put in place tax policies, regulatory policies, education, produced great results. So he has a very good track record to point to. We have very good results. So we've sort of re-vindicated these center-right policies, and I think that's going to help us make the case to keep us going in the direction we're going, instead of swinging far to the left with populist progressive policies, which I think would revert the country.
Great. I'm going to end with a final question, which is, at the height of your political life, you decided to step down and move into a whole new phase of your life. Why did you do that, and what's next for Paul Ryan?
Why I did it is 3 reasons, and they are 15, 16, and 17 years old. I've got 3 high school kids. As you mentioned, or as it was mentioned, I got elected to Congress when I was 28. I got married when I was 20 as a weekend dad. And it was becoming really clear to me that if I stayed as Speaker of the House, being home basically 1 day a week, my kids would never know me. So I just felt that family clock ticking, and I had to get to the point where I have a life now that revolves around my kids while they're in high school, so I can raise them and know them the way you want to know your kids. One of the most gratifying things I do is I teach college at University of Notre Dame. I teach economics. I'm a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I have this foundation, and I get to meet with interesting people, at conferences like this. So it's a great phase of life to be in, and I've got to tell you, it's not the worst time to be out of Congress. It's a pretty good time to not be in Congress. So
timing's everything.
I'm gratified to have had 20 years, and I'm all the better for it.
Great. Please join me in thanking Paul Ryan.